Welcome to One Spark at a Time with me, Rabbi Adam Miller. A Jewish mystical legend tells that during creation, something broke and shattered, scattering sparks of divine holiness around the world. It is our responsibility to do acts of tikkun olam, to repair the world around us. Each time we do a good deed, we are gathering one more of those holy sparks and making the world a little more whole and holy. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by a special guest who is doing this work of repairing our world one spark at a time. My guest today is Abby Leibman, President and CEO at MAZON, a Jewish response to hunger. MAZON is a national organization fighting to end hunger among people of all faiths and backgrounds in the United States and Israel. Toward that end, MAZON channels support from the Jewish community to end hunger in every community, a recognition that this struggle is universal and that human connection runs deep. Abby, thank you for joining me today.
Thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, I'm delighted to have you here. And before your work with MAZON, you've always been a shining light in the nonprofit world. Your consulting work, leading other organizations, including founding the California Women's Law Center. When did you know that you wanted to start down this path of making our world a better place?
Well, I can remember even as a small child feeling that it was important to me that I mattered in the world, that it mattered that I had been born, that I had some impact in some way on the world. I'm sure I could do a lot of psychobabble to figure out where that came from, but generally speaking, I just always felt that I wanted to engage in work in the larger world. In law school, I really felt a strong pull toward the idea of justice and the idea of doing something to help remedy the many injustices that exist in the world. Now, if you looked at my resume, it looks very much as if I had this planned career path that led me from one thing to the next, but really it was a lot of zigzagging. And some of it's just fortuitous. It's just kind of where you land and then what you're exposed to and who you're exposed to. And then one thing leads to another. And that's really the most realistic way of describing what happened in my career path.
Well, certainly that value of pursuing justice, tzedek tirdof, is a deeply ingrained Jewish value. And you reference that it's sometimes the experiences that you have and the people that you meet along the way who help shape it. Who was in those roles for you? Who are some of the key figures and events that really brought you here?
Well, my parents, I know this sounds a little trite, but my parents had very strong ethics. And I mean, when I think of my father, I think of a person who's a real man of integrity. And my mother is a passionate advocate for the vulnerable and the underserved. And one of my earliest memories of being exposed to the fact that there was a larger world in politics, everything, was being in the car with my mom and my two sisters, and my mother turning around from the front seat to look us in the back seat, and she goes, "I'm going to tell you the name of a woman, Helen Gahagan Douglas, and you must never forget her name, because this woman would have been a member of Congress, but for the fact that Richard Nixon blackballed her right before the election, and she had no chance to fight back. And that was wrong." Now, however you feel about Nixon, we don't have to go down that road. But for me, I never forgot her name. I was 6. I was a little kid, and but it was like my mother's passion about this and her outrage at how unjust this was, I think really affected all three of us. But I think I took that in very deeply. And then, as we talk some more, I mean, some other names will come up, I think, in part of this conversation, but I had 2 very significant mentors in my professional life, and both very different, and both mentoring me in different ways. And even in this moment in my life, I have people I look to for guidance and support. And I think you never stop doing that. I mean, at least for someone in my position, where I think of it as essential that I keep learning and listening and being open to what's happening around me in order to be responsive to it.
It's a beautiful story of inspiration. Remembering that from your mom when you were 6 years old and holding on to that name and that story.
Mhm.
You said before that if you looked at your resume, it's almost as if you kind of carved out this path, that there was a plan, but
Mhm.
surely with every plan, there are obstacles, there are challenges, there are moments when we have setbacks.
Mm.
What were some of the times and places where you felt pushback or things that you overcame that shaped your journey?
Well, if you're going to engage in social justice work, civil rights work, social change work, whatever kind of label you want to put on this, it's hard. It takes a long time, and you are going to fail more than you will succeed. And I, I think sometimes those obstacles are other people who don't believe in what you're saying, who want to trivialize what you're doing, or who are dismissive of you. And at different points in my career, those things have become more tangible, more visible for me. When I was a new lawyer, when I was very young, I mean, there's a tendency to dismiss young women, especially at that time. Um, and I was doing, when I was working at the Women's Law Center, among the things that we were doing were issues about advocacy for the inclusion of women in law enforcement.
Mhm.
And that was very difficult and very thankless. And, you get called names. I've been, and even now in my work with MAZON, there are times when we get called names
Wow.
because we've suggested something that is ahead of the curve, if you will, that it feels sort of out there. And then over time, those things become more accepted, which is a big part of what we try to do, is to lift up issues that have either been unaddressed or underaddressed, but are in fact quite pervasive and persistent in this country. And by lifting them up, to not normalize them, but to make them visible and therefore approachable for others, so that it feels safer, if you will, to engage in that work. But I feel like I've had lots of strong colleagues and lots of great partnerships, so that those help keep you going. But, even when we first started the Women's Law Center, and we were looking for initial support for that, and I can remember going to a lawyer friend to see if they wanted to give us some financial support. And he said to me, "Well, what happened to the one that used to be here?" And I said, "What one?" And he goes, "Well, surely there was one here before." I go, "No, there has never been a California Women's Law Center." And
Wow.
he was really taken aback, but I also felt dismissed, like as if I was, doing something that was not as groundbreaking as, I have to admit I thought it was. Um, but it's also that, money is a big challenge in the nonprofit sector. And people didn't want to fund something that was created by women, for women, and led by women. And, this was 1989, and it's the middle of the Reagan era, and there was not a lot of support for women per se, but certainly women's rights, and what that really meant. And that we take for granted now, I think, that women can be in leadership roles, that women are part of the professions. But at that time, there were very few women lawyers, and there were a minuscule number of women who were on the federal and state bench who were judges. And, that you're stymied by your own identity, which we see all over the place in this country all the time. And that was something of a shock to me, I have to say, because I grew up in a house where not only was I taught that I could do whatever I wanted, I was sort of told, you have to do you want to, and you will go. And so, the reality that everybody's not like you is a hard lesson to learn, but it's really important. And then you have to work to overcome that. You do that by building relationships, and that's time consuming, but really meaningful.
It's very powerful to hear you talk about the challenge of your work is there to comfort the afflicted, and yet part of what you have to do in order to accomplish that is to afflict the comfortable. How do you
Yes.
find a balance between those two pieces?
Um, I'm not so sure, to be honest with you, that they fall so neatly into those two categories. You know, one of the things that I think the pandemic really threw into high relief for us is that many millions more Americans are vulnerable, especially to food insecurity, than we ever had thought. So you can move from being that person who sees themselves as a part of the establishment, if you will, the affluent or the secure or the influential, and then find that in the flip of a switch, you are not. Now you are part of the vulnerable. And I mean, a lot of stories that came out of the pandemic about people who said, I used to be a volunteer at this food bank and now I'm coming here for food.
Oh, wow.
So that these kinds of experiences should be lessons for all of us, but you have to bring some essential qualities, I think, into whatever advocacy work you're doing. So coming in without judging those who are struggling is important. These come for us, they come out of Jewish values, right?
Mhm.
This is the teachings of Judaism, is that
Mhm.
we accept that there are people who are vulnerable and people who are in need, and we don't ask you how you got there. We just know that you are there. And then you look at policymakers and you want to be wise, and you also want to be compassionate. And then you also need to be strong. And you cannot back down from the positions that you're taking, because that's why you're there. So when you're an advocate,
Mhm.
your role is to stick your neck out so those people who are vulnerable do not have to. Those who feel they can, and that you want to empower and lift up and partner with, that's a vital part of the fabric of all of this social change. But there are many people for whom it is way too risky to do that. And that's where people like me come in. It's my job to do that.
Mhm.
And so I can't back down from saying, this is the right thing and this is what you have to do, and to hold people accountable. So some of what we do is also about saying who did it and who did not. That in the early days when we started to talk about hunger among currently serving military, we received an avalanche of criticism from people who were sort of military adjacent, like support organizations for the military, and the chaplains, the veterans groups, who said to us, in one remarkable instance, someone told me that I was shaming the United States and shaming the military. And I said, no, I'm telling you what the shameful thing is that they are doing, but I'm not in the business of shaming them. I'm in the business of showing what they're doing. They are accountable for this. And so that was, 9 years ago. And now we have partnerships with all of these same organizations who are highly critical that we were exposing this, who are much more ready to fully embrace that this is a challenge. This country could fix this. And we have to hold ourselves accountable too, and all of that. So I suppose that's the way I walk some of those lines that you're talking about.
Sure. Well, before we get to your work with MAZON in particular, I think it's worth noting that your professional work has brought you to a large number of nonprofit organizations who are seeking to change the world. And that some of that change you've been talking about, it might start with an individual, but you need others around you to work within a system. You've worked with Jewish World Watch and Food Forward, LA's Best, UCLA Hillel, Valley Best Shalom, Synagogue, the Jewish Federation, Council of Greater Los Angeles, Bend the Arc. The list is too long for me to go into all of them here, but I'm curious for our audience for you to help us understand, what are some of the things you've seen these different nonprofits who are all changing the world in different ways? What are some of the best practices you've seen from them, and what can we take into our own organizational work that we might be doing?
So I have to add to that list, there were a couple of places I worked as a professional, right? So I worked for the Commission for Sex Equity, which was in a citizens advisory board to the LA Unified School District on sex discrimination issues. And I also worked at Public Counsel, which was at the time I joined it, a very small legal services office that worked with pro bono lawyers to deliver services to the poor. And it's now, I think, if not the largest, one of the largest direct service legal services offices in the United States. And so I have a mix in my background, both in my professional work as a consultant, my volunteer work, with working with organizations that provide direct service That is, they do things to help support individuals, and those that provide service in a larger sense, like a social change sense, policy change. And I've learned from that I'm most comfortable in the policy change space, that I'm frustrated in a direct service space, that I feel as if I'm not making that difference that I want to make. But nevertheless, I value what I can learn from the direct service providers, because it's they that see what's happening. And what you have to be able to do is to take what you see, whether it's anecdotal or it's a collection of data from a long-term or multiple agencies, you have to take that and translate that into social policy change, because something is driving that. Something is causing this problem on a systemic basis. And, in a democracy, what you do is you work with the public to raise awareness and to engage them in addressing policymakers at the local level, the state level, and the federal level. Now, I work at the national level now, so I'm working with Congress and the White House, and not me by myself, but my colleagues and I. And that has a huge impact. If you can change things at the national level, you're changing things for 360 million Americans. That is no small thing. It also puts a lot of pressure on that. So what I have learned too is that in all of these circumstances, you will lose more than you will win. And that if you set your goal as something that is too big or unmanageable or unachievable in any short term, you will be so discouraged. So I learned to set smaller goals, to understand that if I can move not from A to B, even from A to a little bit further on A to A plus 2 plus A, to get to B, that I can feel a sense of accomplishment and therefore some empowerment and encouragement to move on. It's very discouraging to do this work. And you have to find victories where you can. So that's important. And all of these organizations were about thinking through what's the vision, very important to know what your vision is, and what's our mission. And staying on mission is critically important to a successful nonprofit organization. And if you are engaged in that work as a part of it, whether on the board or the staff, that is a critical piece of learning, and it requires a great deal of discipline. Because our world is swirling with injustices and swirling with ways to address them and issues that demand our attention. And if you have found a focus for what you're working on, you cannot bring everything in there. You can't. You need to think about, where did I start from and why do I want to stay here? Now, of course, it also means you have to be willing to innovate and move forward in that mission. So you can stay within your mission, but you've got to be unstuck. And finding that balance is very difficult. And these were organizations that manage that. I mean, when you work with a synagogue, a synagogue has a particular mission, but within it, there are innovative ways of achieving that mission. And you can think outside the box. And if you are a part of an organization that is dedicated to ending genocide and mass atrocities, you don't suddenly start to work on climate change, no matter how much you could rationalize that climate change is influencing what is happening in these places. It is really about staying on that mission and understanding that if you don't do that work, who will? If you move off mission, what will happen? I can remember years ago doing phone calls with synagogues in the greater Southern California area about engaging them in Jewish World Watch, and calling a leading rabbi in our community and asking if his synagogue wanted to be involved with this. And he said to me, we worked on the genocide in Sudan last year. We're sort of done with it. I was a bit shell-shocked. I told this to my then teenage son, who looked at me and goes, I bet the Darfuris wish they were done with it too.
Ouch.
And I was like, yes. Well, first, I'm very proud of him. And he was like, 13. I mean, that was pretty intense. And I thought to myself, this is why you stay on your work. Because we abandon them, who will step in? Who will do this? And that requires, I think, probably a small amount of hubris to say, we do this, we do it differently, and we do it really well. And that's why we're doing it, because we understand how to approach this in a way that is most meaningful for those who are experiencing whatever that injustice might be, but also how to achieve change for them with those who have the power to do so.
That's a wonderful insight for those who are doing this work, to stay on mission, to stay focused, and appreciate that each of those missions has its unique value, that it's okay that there are other problems out there, which kind of brings me to my next thought for you, which is we watch the news today and we feel overwhelmed by the number of crises, the number of challenges that we are facing right now, from COVID-19 to climate change, fires, hurricanes, Afghanistan, gun violence. The list is endless. Hunger and food insecurity, however, are not as flashy. They're not likely to lead the evening news, but they are every bit as significant and real as what those other things are talking about. So share with us for a moment about the real concerns around hunger and food insecurity, both in America and beyond our borders.
So MAZON's focus really is on the United States and Israel. And we are we're deeply concerned by not only the lack of visibility of this as an issue, but the invisibility of the people who struggle. And you are correct. It doesn't lead the news very often. Certainly during the pandemic, it did. I mean, those images were, I think, a revelation for many Americans. And we estimate that before the pandemic, there were about 37 million people who struggled with food insecurity, which is the more policy-oriented description of what it means to be hungry in America, because it has a significance about the idea that you don't know where your next meal is coming from, which is very different from feeling hungry before lunchtime. Once the pandemic hit, at the height of the pandemic in early to mid 2020, we think there were probably closer to 80 million people who were food insecure. So more than double. And some of that you can draw on from looking at what the unemployment numbers were and understanding that people feel that they'll figure out how to find food somehow. And that's what drives them into food insecurity, because they got to pay the rent or the mortgage. They have obligations around utilities. They have vital medical and health needs that have to be paid for. And they figure, we'll figure something out about food. And this is how you have parents who skip meals so their children can eat. Now, we saw that our government actually did what government should do, right? It took responsibility and it responded to the people who are struggling in this country. And I mean, that's a philosophy of government that was really embraced in the New Deal era, and that the current administration has revitalized, is thinking about government as the solution, not a problem. And I would say that because we look at food insecurity as it affects particular populations, those who live on tribal lands and those in the tribal nations, people who are identify as LGBT seniors, people who are in the military, people who are veterans, single mothers, people in Puerto Rico. Our issue areas are places where we see synergy between them, but understand that there is a specific and unique challenge or challenges facing each of those communities, and that one size will not fit all. So even as we talked about the idea that the government now is going to turn to a revision of the Thrifty Food Plan so it can expand the SNAP benefit, we understand that there are people that have trouble accessing SNAP. So seniors have a problem doing a lot of the paperwork and application that's necessary. So in many states, they've created simplified application processes for seniors, and you have to recertify for SNAP every few months. And if you're a senior, you're not aging into wealth. So the idea that you have to keep retelling the government, yes, I'm struggling, is both difficult, onerous, and humiliating. And so trying to think about, what does that mean? And then if you're many LGBT seniors have those same concerns, but many of them have lived with AIDS, HIV until they begin to age, and they age more rapidly because of having that kind of virus circulating in their bodies. But they also encounter discrimination. And so for many, there's tragic circumstances when they have to move into senior housing, for example, and they go back in the closet in order to do that because they're afraid. And we saw issues about essential workers. Who are the essential workers in America? They're dominated by women, particularly women of color. And who are those women? They're often single mothers. And the struggles we all know too well now, right, between work and family and managing a household and childcare and teaching your children, those fall disproportionately on single moms. And it is a burden that they should not have to add to by trying to figure out whether or not they can feed these children. So these are complexities that have different kinds of solutions that you have to work for. There's nothing simple about hunger. It's straightforward, but it isn't simple. It is complex. And the solutions that we've posited as a country are also complex. And that's sometimes necessary, and then sometimes it's just the nature of how things have changed over time, and we cobble things together. I think there's a real commitment on the part of a lot of agencies to know what one is doing and the other is doing, but that doesn't always happen. And making sure that some of that connection is happening is part of what we do. So we actually bridge some gaps between the Veterans Administration and the U.S. Department of Agriculture. The USDA administers the food stamp program in this country and a lot of other our food support programs. And the VA was not communicating with them, despite the fact that there's a significant number of veterans who are struggling with food insecurity and thought they could get whatever benefits they need through the VA. Well, you can't get SNAP, the food stamp program, through the VA. You have to go through other agencies with which the USDA contracts. So trying to get them to talk to each other turned into a very lengthy process for my colleagues that are based in our Washington, D.C. office. But it came to fruition, and there's a communication there. So again, did we just solve hunger among veterans? No. Did we move forward in creating a framework, a process, the possibility? We sure did. That's a victory.
It's a pretty big victory. And it's amazing to recognize that not only is food insecurity itself a problem, but even just the ways that we might address it, the systems that are in place, all of that are real problems. And while they might not lead the news now, it's still very much happening behind the scenes. And it's something we should be talking about and dealing with. But I imagine it can be difficult at times to communicate that level of need to someone who is not living a life where they're experiencing it themselves. If they've been fortunate and not had to experience it themselves, or have people in their own family struggling with food insecurity, how do you get the message across to individuals who have been removed for the most part, or have chosen to put on blinders and are not experiencing it for themselves?
Stories. The stories, that images. I mean, I think that, in fact, the more ordinary, sometimes the better. The more you can see yourself reflected in that, the better. But it's also an appeal to people's understanding of what it means to be part of a community, however you want to define that community, whether it's your neighborhood, your city, a county, a state. We're all part of a national community. And I don't think anyone doubts that anymore, given what's been happening around COVID in this country, that, viruses don't know barriers. Food insecurity has no barriers. It exists all over this nation, and it's existed forever. And it is possible to correct it, but it's also important to help people realize that these are real people. I mean, MAZON did an amazing audiovisual experience. We sent a photojournalist all over the country to take photographs and interview people who struggle with hunger currently in the United States. And we turned it into this traveling exhibit that was in an 18-wheeler, went all over the country. And the images and the voices of the people themselves were part of that experience. It's now permanently housed in a location in Los Angeles. But it was, I think, the most compelling way for us to tell this story. I mean, these are people who had great jobs, got laid off, and then suddenly here they were. And people who had wonderful degrees in education, and then suddenly here they were. People who have struggled for a lifetime and are trying to move themselves out of poverty, and children who just really are so compelling to listen to, and they tell you that this is what's happening to us right now, but we're not always going to be like this. And when we're okay and on our feet, this little girl says, then we're going to help other people, because we will understand exactly what it feels like to go through this.
Oh, wow.
I mean, she's like 11, 12 years old. I mean, that is such a compelling message for me. And I think anybody who hears that message is moved by it. And as I said, this problem is not a problem that is insoluble. We came close in this country, and we could do this again, but it requires a great deal of will, sometimes political will. But if we turn our minds to this, we could do it, and not be so incremental, but being intentional and much more expansive in our thinking.
Oh, that story just cuts right through.
I know.
When you're sharing those stories, and you're talking about some of the statistics and the facts behind that young woman's experience, or the experience of others who've been touched by hunger, what pieces do your audience find most shocking or surprising along the way?
Depends on the audience. Depends on what biases you bring into the room with you. Hunger is not a problem of people living in the inner city of America. Hunger is a big problem in rural America. That those people who grow and produce our food also are struggling with food insecurity. That hunger is not a problem of people who are not like them. And you want to create an other. This is why I personally don't like to keep referencing the ideas about you have to help the poor people. First of all, hunger is not a problem of poverty. It is a problem that goes beyond poverty. But it's also that they are us. This is not noblesse oblige. This is not those who are successful helping the poor, struggling people. Yuck.
Yeah.
Yuck. This is what tzedakah is. It is justice. It is reflecting on and recognizing that we are they, B'Tselem Elohim, we're all made in the image of God, and that our struggles are going to be different, but they could come up for us at any time. Her name was Desiree, just like Desiree said, it's our reality right now, but sometime it won't be. And so we have to recognize this is not our reality right now, but someday it might be. And how do you want other people to respond to you? So I think that those are things that shock people. I think the idea that there's even hunger in America is shocking for many people.
Really?
This is the richest country in the world. And we have somewhere between, at this point, 40 and 80 million people who don't know whether or not they're going to eat dinner tonight. I find that shocking.
It is a stunning and staggering statistic to have in front of us. You referenced the fact that hunger has no boundaries. And the work of MAZON is to begin with Jewish values and use resources from the Jewish community, but to share those with everyone, recognizing that it's important to touch all the different communities and address food insecurity everywhere. What kind of response do you get as a Jewish organization going out into the larger community doing this work? And what kind of response do you get from those who are interested in your work and are curious why it's so important to go across all of the boundaries and help everyone?
So MAZON, from its founding, was about ending hunger among people of all faiths and backgrounds. And just what I assume you mean by no boundaries. We cross boundaries. And we're pretty well received in most secular settings. As I said, we do a lot of our work up on Capitol Hill. We are now the pretty much the recognized anti-hunger experts on issues affecting currently serving military. No one has ever asked, why is the Jewish organization doing this? They may wonder it, but nobody's ever asked us directly.
Interesting.
One of the things that I know really informs our work, that I think is a really significant part of how people work with us and accept us, is that they know that our work is values driven. We don't have some kind of other axe to grind. We don't have a giant political agenda. This is steeped in Jewish tradition and Jewish values, which are, are very significant in the Jewish community, certainly, but I think across communities, people understand what those are. And oftentimes it gets us some access we might not otherwise have. So those who are loath to have people that come in the room that they perceive are going to be very hostile adversaries will invite us into the room because they see us as coming from a different kind of perspective. One of the largest anti-hunger organizations in this country is a wonderful organization called Bread for the World, which is Christian. It's very much Christian in the way we are Jewish, and it's much larger than we are because there are many more Christians in this country. But there's a sense of balance and egalitarianism that happens in the political space, where if they invite Bread for the World into the room, they invite us. And we keep working to try to get Islamic relief in the room too. So this idea that there's no one religious monolithic organization that can respond to this, that we all work together, these values are really important. Right. I also don't think that, I don't think it really even occurred to our founders that it would be a challenge to say to the Jewish community that we're doing this for everybody. I think once they did it, they recognized that there was some pushback. They were very careful and intentional about the name of the organization. MAZON is a Jewish response to hunger, not a response to Jewish hunger. And that doesn't mean we don't care about Jews who are struggling. Of course we do. And of course they are a part of this. But this is really about what I think the Jewish community does in many settings, which is living the values that we have been taught, that are commanded us in the Torah, to care about the stranger, to be concerned about our neighbor, to not judge. And I think that my experiences with the Jewish community have been that they fully embrace that this lifts them up to feel that they are a part of a larger movement, that they are a part of a greater good, and that it is not self-serving. It's about all of us. And I think I don't encounter a lot of pushback from individuals, certainly in the Jewish community, about that, nor have we had doors closed to us, at least not in a obvious sense, because we are a Jewish organization working on issues.
So questions have come in wondering about the aspect you do on lobbying, and in particular, recognizing something I think we can all acknowledge, which is our world's fractured right now, particularly along political lines. And they're curious to know, how is it when you go into a room, even if you're starting out with, you're there because of what you're doing to meet a need, there's still some political solution to the problem. How do you bring people together around these subjects instead of pushing them further apart?
Well, first of all, we have an amazing team that leads our work up on the Hill. So our Vice President of Public Policy, Josh Protas, and his colleague, Kyle Fredkin, and our VP of Programs, Mia Hubbard. These are people who are not only experienced and knowledgeable, they're really nice. So one of the things that I think people don't recognize necessarily, if you don't have to spend a lot of time up on the Hill, is that it is a grind for those in office, because they see one lobbyist after another. They see, one influencer after another. And, a lot of these people are deadly dull, or really angry, or quite aggressive. The big pharma is these are people, like, okay, I got to do this. When you meet with people and you genuinely like them, You come in with an open mind and you want it, people are receptive to that. Now, we also get the privilege of building on the fact that hunger in this country was always addressed as a bipartisan issue. I mean, certainly since like the last 50, 55 years. The modern version of the food stamp program was really created by then Senator Robert Dole and then Senator George McGovern, who could not have been more different in their political approaches. But George McGovern took Robert Dole to Mississippi, and they spent time there, and he was forever changed by that. And they created this infrastructure to help address hunger in America. And the reason I stumbled and said Jim McGovern has been a leading advocate to end hunger in America. And he has strong and good relationships across the aisle. So this is also part of this, is the, sort of the stuff that doesn't make the front page, is that, these are people, men and women, who work together all the time. And for the most part, they can. There are extremists, and, that's just the nature of things. But because we can build on a history of bipartisan and nonpartisan work, we can get some access, some conversation where we might not otherwise. The challenge in the current time is that things that even seem innocuous have become politicized. And so working through that is a challenge. And you look for champions, and we look for people on both sides of the aisle. I mean, our military work is supported by both Republicans and Democrats. The work we do around tribal nations, there's some support for that. The seniors work we do, there's some questions probably for some of them around the LGBT senior, but that's our job. Our job is to move this forward. And, if you can't move somebody, when you're a lawyer, this is what they teach you when you're in a courtroom. If the facts are on your side, you pound the facts. If the law is on your side, you pound the law. And if neither the law nor the facts is on your side, you pound the table. So some of what we do is we pound the table, not because we don't have facts or law, but we got to change the law and we can't get attention. Sure. So we pound the table, because that's what we do. Mm-hmm. That's what we have to do. And, negotiating in Congress is no different from any negotiation. You can think of what you do even in your own family structures, right? Is you ask for the moon, and then you're willing to settle for the half moon because you've staked out a position. So that's part of what you do, is you work with colleagues to fashion what do we know our ultimate goal is? Okay, what do we want to ask for so we can end up there? I don't think negotiating is a big secret. This is what people do.
Okay. Well, it's certainly a lot of work that goes into this, into bridging those divides, politically speaking. Yes. I also have some questions coming in about wanting to know how you address bridging the divides of the generations. How do you engage young people in the work that you're doing? And how do you engage seniors, bringing them all together around addressing food insecurity?
So I'm not sure that I have magic answers to intergenerational work. But I am also aware that there's a preoccupation in the nonprofit sector with engaging young people. I don't know what that is. The older I get, the older young people get. I have no idea. Young people used to be teenagers, and now they're people in their 40s. So I'm not sure that I think it's fair to think about this generationally. I think it's fair to think about it as what people's lived experience has been, and what it means to feel that you have a moment in your life when you can engage in this work, when you can give back, or you can make this your professional choice, that it isn't the same point in time for everybody. What I would say is that it's important for people to explore whether or not they have that sensibility, that to put it in the background and say, oh, I'm not going to deal with that. I don't want to have to think about that. I don't think that that's a way to live your life. And I would encourage people not to live their lives that way. I mean, if you're going to be aware, then what you need to do is not just make noise about it, but you also have to engage in change. If what calls to you is serving meals to people, to transporting people to shelters, to engaging in carbon recycling, whatever, then do the direct service work. And if what calls to you is more of what has called to me my whole life, which is changing things so they're better for a broad part of our communities, then start. Because if you hesitate, you will just stop and continue to stop. But I think it's important to know who you are, what you want, and what you're capable of, and to be aware of what you don't know as well as what you do know. I think that's harder for younger generations. And you have to recognize this is a marathon and you got to pace yourself, because if you go too fast, too strong, too soon, you'll burn out. And I would say through all of this, the most vital thing is to connect to people. I mean, finding people that you respect, that you enjoy being in their company in order to do this work, because it requires a big commitment. And what you want to do is feel that you have colleagues in this, and that you are supported as well as supporting others. And I mean, a big part of why I so treasure my experience at MAZON is that the board and the staff are all remarkable people. They just are. But more than that, they are so caring for each other as well as about these issues. And that we can recognize when somebody is so frustrated or is so discouraged or feels that they have nothing left to give. And then our job as their colleagues becomes helping them feel re-energized, providing them whatever support they need. This is hard work, and you don't want to do it alone.
It is very difficult work, and you've been putting your heart and soul into this. I know that SNAP is one of the pieces from a advocacy point that you work a lot with in MAZON. Where are we right now with programs like SNAP, and what do you see in the future?
SNAP is well, it's about to get better funded again. We hope, we'll see, but that doesn't mean the work is done. I mean, right now, the average SNAP benefit gives you about $1.40 per meal for any individual, and it now will be $1.80. So now you might be able to buy a cup of coffee. You know, these numbers, it sounds as if it is a momentous shift. The idea of looking at this and wanting to change it and to expand its support, that is monumental. The amount needs to go further. We have to keep working further. But yeah, I'm fine with the idea of like, okay, step forward. Now we're going to build from that step forward. But the SNAP is, by definition, the acronym stands for Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. So by definition, it's meant to supplement your resources that you can spend on food. It is not meant to supplement whatever your financial resources are. The theory behind this was you could pay for some portion of your food, just not all of it. Well, that's baloney. And most people, when they rely on SNAP, that's their entire food budget. And it runs out typically around the third week of every month. And that's when people line up at food pantries, go to soup kitchens, that the charitable sector is forming that vital lifeline between when your government benefits are there and when they run out. And it's just not equipped to fill that whole need, and only the federal government can. So when you look and you say, if you're giving people what is, basically less than $6 a day to feed themselves, you are not fully feeding them. And yet that's what this program has turned into. And so that's why we have to address bigger picture issues here. So the program is, I think, fairly secure. The issues I always have had to do with how funded it is, of what the benefit would be, and who can access the benefit and for how long. So, the regulatory process in the last administration tried its best to dismantle people's access, to make it harder to get onto the program and to limit how long people could be on it. In many ways, really providing a significant decrease in the number of people who could get benefits. And so we're seeing that being remedied. And that happened during the pandemic relief bills that were coming through the House and the Senate.
So for a moment, pulling out your crystal ball, if you could look 5, 10, 25 years in the future, what would you hope that you have seen accomplished, and what would exceed your expectations?
Okay. Well, I hope that I expect that MAZON will still be here. I expect that it will continue to innovate and address things that are going unaddressed, that need to be addressed. I hope that it is stable and well-funded and secure. I hope that we are looking at a country that is looking how to be better at doing its best for people who are vulnerable. Do I think that's a short-term proposition? Yeah. But in the next few years, we will have another farm bill. Now, the farm bill is this huge omnibus piece of legislation that addresses forestry and waterways and agriculture, and also all of the nutrition programs. And I hope that what we will see are innovations in what's in the farm bill to help people who are struggling, that we see investment in novel ways of delivering service, that we see investment in helping to support whatever additional expense attaches to having nutritious food in your diet, that we see those communities that have issues about access being given opportunities, that we have the infrastructure in place that allows people who live in rural America to get the benefits that they need. So I think that those are things that look like they're on the horizon, and we may see them come to fruition, but I'm confident that MAZON will be right there pushing to try to make sure that they do.
Wonderful. A final thought, Abby. You are an inspiration to so many with the work that you are doing. What would you say to someone who sees a problem in the world but hasn't yet taken that first step to themselves be collecting the sparks and making our world more whole?
I would say, if you know what it is, if you see this problem and you know what it is, then talk to other people who are doing something about it. Just talk to them. Find out if there's a way you could be helpful. I have a much more entrepreneurial nature than many people do. So for me, it's like I want to start things. I want to invest in my energy in creating, but not everybody feels that, and that's daunting sometimes. But I would say that it's really important, again, to connect with people and take a small step. Start by donating. Believe me, if you start donating to an organization that's working on something that you feel is important, you don't even have to be passionate about it. You just feel it's important. They'll reach out to you and you'll learn more. And that may be all it takes to move you to a place of like, oh, well, here's a piece of work. I could do that, or I could contribute to this. I could be a part of this. One of my mentors, who was my boss at public counsel way back in the day, had been on its board. And as a member of its board, found that he really wanted to do this work full time. He never thought he did. He was a lawyer in private practice. And the executive left and he applied for the position and didn't get it the first time. And he stayed on the board, continued to do this. Next time, years later, he did it, and they hired him, and he was there for 20 years or something. Wow. And he made amazing changes in it and developed it into something that's so this is why I look to him as like, what do you do when you're in an organization and you want to be entrepreneurial? But his passion didn't come to him until he knew more. I mean, the more you learn sometimes, the more it is that you realize, oh, this is a place where I want to make a difference. It may not be the only place,
right?
But it will be a place. So that's what I would say.
Wonderful advice and wisdom. Well, thank you, Abby, for being my guest today on One Spark.
Thank you for having me.
I really appreciate you sharing your passion for making our world a better place and your work as the CEO and president of MAZON. I want to thank all of those who are out there listening in our audience. If you missed any part of our experience today or want to catch up on some of our other engaging conversations from the past, you can check us out on Apple Podcasts, where you can download, listen, and follow the One Spark at a Time podcasts. Know that our future guests after the High Holy Days will include Karen McGovern from Star Ability, an organization that transformed the lives of those individuals with disabilities, and Judith Rosenbaum from the Jewish Women's Archive.
Yeah.
As we finish today, I would share with you, as always, the teaching from Gandhi: be the change you want to see in the world. May you be inspired from our conversation today to go out into the world and embrace the change that you want to see, knowing that each and every one of us has the power to fix our broken world, one spark at a time.